Hello, I'm Suzanne. I am a watercolor artist and an urban sketcher. I'm here to share the process behind this watercolor winter landscape. This was inspired by a routine morning walk on a very cold and sunny day. I started off with thumbnail sketches just to figure out the colors that I would like to use. And I think I'm going to go with the third one. I also did a few pencil sketches just to figure out the composition of the painting that I would like to do. So I'm going to start off with the larger painting. So I've started with a rough pencil sketch. The line that you can see at the bottom 1/3 of the paper is where my middle ground finishes. The foreground is where the tree or the shrub is, right in front of us on the left side. And I'd like to place a tree on the right side, which is beyond the middle ground. I will share the reference picture on my page as well. However, the reference picture is just as a guidance, and I have changed a few things in there. It was just so that I could get the colors of the sky accurately. The paper that I'm using here is Saunders Waterford by St. Cuthbert's Mill. It is a watercolor block, so which means you can see how the paper is glued together to create a block. It is pre-stretched, which means it saves time. I'm also going to put this block at an angle using a tape. It can be anything, just put it under there just to get that angle. It is a very comfortable way of looking at the painting compared to having it flat down on the table. So the first color that I am going to activate and use is Cobalt Blue. That's the blue of the sky that I'm going to use today. Next color is Quinacridone Red. And finally, it is cadmium-free yellow. You can also use cadmium yellow. Cadmium-free yellow is a new range of paint by Winsor & Newton, and I absolutely love this color. Once my paint is prepared, I am going to start wetting the watercolor block. And I'm starting off with Cobalt Blue for the sky. I'm using a flat brush to get an even layer of paint on the paper. And because my paper is already wet, I don't need to add a lot of water to the mixture of blue, so which is why I sometimes like to go straight into the damp watercolor cake to add some fresh blue onto my wet paper. Once I have an even layer of blue on there, I'm going to go into my next color, and you can see I'm not washing my brush here because the colors are going to get mixed up anyway, and I went straight into Quinacridone Red. So you can see, because the paper is wet, how you get a smooth finish on the watercolor paper. And finally, I'm going to add some fresh cadmium-free yellow. I mix it into the Quinacridone Red so it turns slightly orange, still keeping the rose color to the top of the sky. The main reason I started with red and not yellow is because I didn't want to mix a muddy green with the yellow and blue, which is why the red comes in between. And I quite like the way the blue and the red mixes to create a nice rose/purple shade. And now for the ground that's below the sky, I'm going to add some cobalt blue to start with. The reference picture shows that the ground is quite frosty, so there's not a lot of green that I can see there. However, I am going to add a slight tinge of cadmium free yellow into that blue that I've mixed there. So you can see how that blue has toned down a little bit, creating a sort of a dull, slightly greenish, bluish middle ground over there. So before that paper dries, I'm topping up the top of that sky with a bit more cobalt blue. While that paper is still quite wet, I'm going to go in with some deeper quinacridone red and some cadmium-free yellow. So this time you can see I haven't used any water at all. I've gone straight into that pan of colour and added in the colour on my paper. So I'm trying to build the background, the city or the town that I can see, and it's all sunlit. It's nice bright orange slash pink color tones over there. And using a damp brush, I am going to lift out some pigment so I can get the middle ground back. So that's where the land ends, that, and the rest of it is in the background. So I'm just going to lift out some color there, just bringing back that ground over there. Now the paper is still wet, but if I take a little bit longer time to mix the colors, the paper would begin to dry just a little bit, but not too much. I'm going to mix all the three colors that we have been using so far. That's quinacridone red, cobalt blue, and some cadmium-free yellow. And for deeper tones, I'm using a tiny bit of indanthrene blue just to get that deep purple color, and I'm going to use that to paint in a tree on the right side. So from where I was looking, this landscape, and I'm looking from the top of a hill, and the tree that I'm painting now is beyond the foreground or the middle ground that you can see here, which is the whitish color, the lower 1/3 of the paper. And the tree stands beyond that, which means I can only see the top half of the tree. I'd like to create that distance, which is why I'm trying to paint that wet in wet here. And because the paper is still quite wet, I would also need to do a little bit of lifting out so that color doesn't seep into the middle ground or the ground that you can see at the bottom of the paper. I'd like to show some depth by placing some more trees behind these trees that I've painted, which means I don't need the colors as saturated as these trees. So I've toned it down a bit, added a slightly bit more of yellow in there, and I haven't used any indanthrene blue for that wash that I just did behind or on the side of the trees that we did initially. So you can see the color difference there. There's no indanthrene blue in what I just did. And there's immediately a sense of depth. You can feel, almost feel as if that foliage is in the background. And I'm going to continue that pattern or that shape on the left side as well. I'm not too worried about the shape, exact shape of the trees. I'm just going to place a largish shape for the background over there. It can be read as trees or mountains, anything that it works out to be. I'm just letting the paper decide at this stage. And I'm using the same mixture to add a few details just to suggest that there's a town in the background there. From where I'm looking, it's in the valley, it's down below, and I can only see just a few details, maybe like the roof of the buildings, and that is where the horizon is. And just a few brush strokes is more than enough. Again, the color that I've mixed here is the same three colors, but this time you can see there's more of red and yellow in there than blue. and that is what gives that sunlit glow. And to add just a few details, maybe trees, tops of the roof, some shadows, I'm adding drops of the mixture that I used for the trees. So that's the purple mixture. So both these mixtures have used the same three colors, except that it's got a little bit more blue in it for the darker tones. Because the paper is quite wet still, I can see that the paint is seeping into the middle ground, which I do not want. So I'm going to use a dry paper towel to lift out the pigment, the paint that is unnecessary over there. I'm also going to lift out some paint from the trees and a bit of paint lifted out from the background as well. It just gives a sense of depth, just bringing in some light into this painting. And I'd also like to add a little bit of a cityscape, a silhouette of the city far away, right on the horizon. And for this I'm using the same color that I used for, same mixture that I used for the trees in front, but added a little bit more water so it's not too stark. And I'm going to add a little bit more deeper tones on the left side of the landscape. This is because I can see that the sun is rising from the other side, leaving this side a little bit darker. And also there's another tree that, or a shrub, that's going to come into the foreground. So I would like that background to be a bit more darker, giving it a contrast compared to the right side of the painting. And because the paper is still wet, I can just add in that pigment, let it blend into the background colors there. Using the same mixture, I'm going to give a little bit of texture on that ground at the bottom of the painting. So just dragging the brush along. It's a dry brush with a little bit of pigment on there, and you can see it's already created texture. And finally, the paper is beginning to dry. It's still a bit damp, but it's not really wet or anything. So at this stage, I'd like to lift out a little bit of pigment from the background. This is where the silhouette of trees are going to be in the background. So I'm just going to lift out, leaving that rough brush strokes there itself. I don't really need to wipe out all the pigments from there. Just creating some texture with my brush is more than enough. And now I'm going to let this completely dry before I can add more details in the foreground. Now this layer is completely dry. I'm going to go in with some finer details of the trees. And the mixture that I'm using here is the same mixture that we used before for the tree. So that's a mixture of all three colors that we used, with a little bit of indanthrene blue into that mixture just to create that deep blue purple shade. Just a few brush strokes to create the texture of the tree. Using a finer brush, I'm going to add in some details of branches on those trees in the background. And the brush that I'm using here is a dagger or a sword brush. You can even use a rigger brush or a fine tip brush for this purpose. The color that I'm using here is the same mixture again. I haven't added anything new to it. You can see it's the same color. But if you think it's too stark for the trees in the background, you can add in a little bit of water to tone it down so you get a much toned down mixture for the trees in the background. After waiting for a few minutes, I think I'm ready to add the shrub in the foreground. The color again is the same mixture of the three colors: cobalt blue, cadmium free yellow, and quinacridone red, with a little bit of indanthrene blue. And this time I do not like it to be completely purple blue shade. So I've added a little bit more cadmium free yellow in there. So I've got this deep grey purple shade right now, and I'm just going to paint the shrub in the foreground. I did use my reference picture just to get the branches of the shrub. Another way of lifting out paint is also using a sharp edge of a palette knife or the sharper edge of a pen or anything sharp to scrape out paint. And I've used a palette knife here just to scrape out some paint, creating those stark highlights on the branches of the shrub. And finally, using a dry brush with a little bit of pigment but absolutely no water in there, just to create texture in the foreground for any sort of shrub or bushes that are in the foreground. And with this, my winter landscape is complete. I hope you enjoyed the process, and I hope you are interested to paint along with this tutorial. Feel free to get in touch with any sort of questions that you may have, either here or on my Instagram, and I look forward to hearing from you. Happy painting, everyone. Bye.